Okay, so well, welcome everybody to the Colloquium series. It's a great pleasure to introduce Sebastian Galiani. So Sebastian is Mark Olson Professor of Economics at the University of Maryland. He's a National Bureau of Economic Research Fellow. He was Deputy Minister of Economics in Argentina for almost 2 years. He's editor of several journals, and I'm not going to read the list of journals in which he has been published. Otherwise, there are not going to be any colloquium. And such a good friend. Okay, so it's my pleasure to have you here, Sebastian. He will be talking about the role of comparative advantage on industrial policy design and effectiveness. Given that industrial policy seems to be back into the tools of policies that people are discussing, I think it's a timely topic to talk about today. So thank you, Sebastian, to be here.
Thank you, Gustavo. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you to all of you for the interest in my talk. Yes, I'm going to be talking about the role of comparative advantage on industrial policy, design and effectiveness. And I think it's a paper that is very timely to present it, and that's why we did it, because there is a lot of calls in countries like the US and Europe to do industrial policy, but also in the typical countries that always try to do industrial policy, like Mexico, Brazil, or Argentina, and others, okay? And so a typical story that is emerging is now that there is some new empirical work exploiting some of the programs that were done in countries like South Korea and Taiwan, etc., that had a positive impact. That somehow, if you believe the results, you can always argue, but I'm not gonna get into that, right? You can always argue whether they are well identified or not, but let's take that as given. Yeah, those show programs that were successful. The question always, not only in this case, but always, is whether that extrapolates to other cases, right? It's what in the applied literature you call the internal validity versus external validity. So this paper, first of all, will say a lot about industrial policy on its own, but also it's going to tell a lot about how we should interpret all this empirical literature. And more generally, we're going to redefine the issue of external validity into a part that is predictable and a part that is not predictable. And I think that's going to be very important in looking forward. And I say this as someone that had already a paper in which I worked through the formal definition of external validity from a statistical point of view. Okay, so not that I'm just saying it. I know the literature well, and I think this is very important. Okay. So basically, this paper with Gustavo, with whom we have been working for 15 years maybe, on issues of political economy, where trade always play an important role, and the reason why we think trade plays an important role, and more recently we work on geopolitics, is because essentially, trade is really important. It shapes always everywhere winners and losers, and those align politically around interests related to trade. Of course, trade's not the only thing that matters in a country, but it's important, right? And so that's why we think it's very important. All right. So, and then we added in this paper a co-author, Martin Caruso Bloch, that was also a former student, and now is at the International Monetary Fund. Okay. So can I get rid of this? So essentially, in summary, basically, we're going to put a model. The model is on itself, we're not trying to innovate on industrial policy, right? We're not trying to come with a new argument for why industrial policy should exist. We want to put a model in which industrial policy could, when could, in principle, be welfare improving, right? So because if you don't start with the possibility that it's welfare improving, then you kill it from the beginning, right? So there's no point. So then in that case, laissez-faire or not doing anything is not gonna be the optimal policy. So we give it a shot, basically. Put it this way: we give it a shot to industrial policy. So there's gonna be in the manufacturing sector. Everywhere there's going to be external economies, right? Total factor productivity, as you'll see in the next slide or so, is going to increase with the number of firms, right? The more firms that produce in the manufacturing sector increase the whole productivity, right? For every firm, and hence the aggregate. And so because of that, there is an externality. Firms always prefer the others to enter first, and enters once the other enter, because that had increased productivity. And ceteris paribus, their own productivity, of course. That doesn't mean there's not going to be one that enters first, but and then there is a call, or there is a potential for a subsidy to improve welfare. Okay, so that's going to be the setup. There is this potential. But we're going to consider the same policy, exactly the same policy, across different economies. And these economies will be characterized by the degree of comparative advantage in the other sector, which is going to be one based on natural resources. You can think of land in case of countries that produce soybean or meat, or it could be oil, or it could be minerals or diamonds, whatever, right? So the countries that, and we will call that natural resource R, and the better endowed relatively a country is in R, the higher its comparative advantage in that other sector. And we want to say how then the same industrial policy works as a function of R. Right? That's one objective. And that objective, let's say, is positive. It's one in the positive realm of economic analysis. We want to say something very basic, but important, right? Remind people, look, you don't expect them to work the same. That's the first thing. But the problem is that when you tell that to people, they say, nah, but that's because the countries that have natural resources are less developed and are more corrupt. They have worse institutions. So institution, it's a car that you play all the time and you just play everything. So they have worse institutions, and that's it. That's right. But if we do it right, I don't know why you think you're gonna do it right, but let's put that aside. If you do it right, then it will work. It will work, okay? And what we're gonna say, and this is very interesting, is that we're gonna give every country the same institutions. And we're gonna show that the higher R, the more corruption is in industrial policy. Has nothing to do with institutions. Again, it's just a result of the incentives that the same policy with same institutions creates differentially for government and firms in different setups of comparative advantage. And this is very new. It's a very new result because it's just telling people, wait. The fact that you find in the data a correlation that the countries with a lot of corruption fail at industrial policy is not proof that that's the cause for why it fails. It's another outcome of the industrial policy. Of course, when you do it, an industrial policy in a country, let's say that you go to Dubai And you say, okay, we're gonna produce here umbrellas. Of course, it's not gonna work, right? The wages are $500,000 in Dubai. So it's impossible to be competitive. But if you just go and start give subsidies, only thing you're gonna get is corruption. You're not gonna get any output. So that what that is saying is that corruption has to be endogenous. You can't put it as the explanation for. Of course, in the real world, it could be that on top, it is true that some of these countries with high R has worse institutions. I'm not gonna disagree with that, by the way. And that's another reason to be cautious. But what we want to show at the theoretical level is that we don't need institutions or being worse to say that you're gonna get more corruption in certain environments that you know. Okay, that's broadly the objective. Okay, and then there is the political economy. We get there too. Okay, what's the timing? Tell me that because
Until
About half an hour.
yeah, half an hour.
half an hour. Okay.
Yes.
I will not be very technical, right? I'm gonna give you a flavor of things, but I'm gonna try to be intuitive. Okay. Stop me at any point if you want. So as I say, there's two narratives right now. One is skeptical, many industrial policy failures, and then basically this is just capture, misallocation, don't do it, okay? The other is optimistic, we can correct market failures, and there is a new quasi-experimental evidence that shows that sometimes it works, okay? And as I say, we built a model to try to analyze this thing, okay? So let me tell you what's the idea in the model. Model, very simple, it works like this. Essentially, there is a household, and that provides the total labor in the economy, and that will be allocated between sectors. Then there's the agricultural sector that essentially every farm or whatever, if it's oil, every firm will produce using the natural resource and labor with standard Cobb-Douglas production function. So here, there's no externalities or anything that could justify any government intervention. Then there is the manufacturing sectors, and here there is an entry cost into manufacturing. And essentially, the most, okay, there is an entry cost, right? So that matters because essentially only the firms that has a productivity high enough will enter, okay? But the productivity of every firm is subject to external economies. So essentially, it depends on how many others enter of the potential of firms. Let's say that there is a potential, right? We measure unit 1, okay? So if all then enters, that's the maximum productivity. If very few enter, the firms that enter has ceteris paribus, lower productivity. So here is the externality, and because there is externality here, there is a potential for a subsidy delta to improve welfare. Okay, and that's a very standard setup in industrial policy. We didn't create much here, I would say. And so then basically there is a general equilibrium. In general equilibrium, once you fix delta and you take R as, we were gonna vary R across economies, that's our comparative statics, you determine an equilibrium. And in equilibrium, you determine the allocation of labor, which obviously depends on how many firms, the share of firms that enter. And then you determine welfare, and the welfare is just the quantity of agricultural goods that are produced, plus the value of the production of the manufacturing sector. Okay, pretty standard. And we're gonna take prices as exogenous. So all this assumes that economies are small, right? If economy is big, there is an additional issue. But I think it doesn't matter, right? Because if you think about that, the best case for industrial policy, it's always when an economy is small, because it doesn't affect prices. So you expand the manufacturing sector, but you don't deteriorate the terms of trade, right? if you say, okay, in the US, you have to be careful also. This discussion we should add it in the paper, but you see, because naturally, if you do industrial policy and you are successful, you will have what you were saying, immeasurizing growth, right? Because you will deteriorate the terms of trade. All right, so essentially, in the agricultural sector, I want to notice there's going to be only one wage, and it's very important that you notice that wages will equal the marginal productivity in both sectors. So the value of marginal productivity will be equalized across sectors. But this is something that always find that people don't really have in mind when they talk about, going, let's say, to South Africa or Dubai and trying to stimulate the manufacturing sector. Is that wages in equilibrium are an increasing function of the amount of natural resources. So the richer you are in natural resources, the higher are the wages, right? And those wages will be very, very high relative to the productivity in the manufacturing sector, if that's not where you have the comparative advantage. And that's it. And here it's all driven by R, okay, where you have the comparative advantage. So that's important, right? So the manufacturing sector will also be standard. Every firm will have a production function that has idiosyncratic productivity, right? So firms, you can order them in terms of their own specific productivity that follows a distribution, Pareto with parameter theta, okay? So the only thing that you need to get from here, not to get technical, is that some firms will be more productive and some will be less. So if they find optimal to enter, the ones that will find optimal to enter are the ones that have the larger set. Okay? And then it's the externality. Total, the product depends on the share of firms that enter. Okay? So then every firm in a market equilibrium will decide whether they enter or not, and they will enter basically if the profits, the variable profits, are larger than the cost of entry. And the cost of entry will be the wage times the FM, which is the amount of workers that they use for entering. Okay, to pay that entry cost, the entry cost at market value is wage times FM. Okay, and then they pay 1 minus the subsidy, right? So if the subsidy is 0, well, they pay just the full cost, and the higher is the subsidy, the lower they pay. That's why a higher subsidy induces more entry, right? And because it induces more entry, it increases productivity overall. Okay, that's why the subsidy will work. Good. Then there is an equilibrium for the labor market, where essentially the supply is distributed on working on primary sector, manufacturing, or just paying the entry cost, or working the whatever it takes to do the entry cost, and then we have the welfare. Is it fine? Fine? Okay. So in this model, there is equilibrium. There's two possible equilibria. One is no entry equilibrium, and the other is a positive equilibrium. Anyway, that's standard in the literature, okay? It's a result that we don't need to get a lot more. So how then subsidy works? Well, if we increase the subsidy, there is a higher entry, as we saw from the equation that moves entry. So productivity increase, even if that also increase wages. Okay. Then the sector, the manufacturing sector expands, so the agriculture sector has to contract by definition, right? Because the resources are given. So the employment in the agriculture goes down and the production in the agriculture goes down. Then the increase in demand of employment in the manufacturing sector is not monotonic, because first it rises because of the productivity effects, but then falls because of the wage effect. Okay. But X, the value, and hence the welfare, always rise with delta. Okay, it dominates. So as we move from 0 to 1 delta, we can just have a possibility for production frontier of QA and XM, right? And this will still have the normal shape that we know from standard economics. So now we will look at how this changed, right? When we change R. So hold the subsidy fixed and now increase R. So it's like saying the same industrial policy in countries that are more and more natural resource well endowed, right? So they are richer in terms of natural resources, have lower comparative advantage, ceteris paribus, in the manufacturing sector. So here agriculture gets more productive, that increases wages. So the entry share goes down. So it's harder for the marginal firms to enter, given the fact that wages are higher. And remember that the entry cost depends on wages. Okay. And so manufacturing output goes down, both via lower external economies and because of higher cost. So the point is that greater R makes the same subsidy less potent. And this is the first important result I was talking about, right? So I go to South Korea, I study the policy with microdata. Ideally, I even do an experiment, right? So I believe the result. And I say industrial policy increase industrialization in 5%. And now I go to Dubai and tell the leader of Dubai, the heck, and say, look, why don't you do industrial policy here? And he will look to me and say, this guy is crazy, right? I said, no, there is a paper that shows that it increased productivity. The point is that in there, it's not going to work because they are so rich in R that probably, basically, no firm will enter, no matter what's the subsidy, right? I'm probably exaggerating. But the point, this is the point. The point is that it's not just the fact that under laissez-faire, the economies with large R will have less industrialization. The point is also one of the cross derivative is that even those economies, if you give the same industrial policy, are going to respond less. Okay, so you can extrapolate whatever you find empirically in the good countries. Okay, good countries in the sense countries in which you did the industrial policy that has low R, because those were the ones where you should expect it worked better. Okay, yeah.
So, Sebastian, is there a threshold in which these industrial policies will work? You say, well, in rich countries, it doesn't work. So what would be the threshold for a country to know, okay, in my circumstances, it will work, and this other case?
No, I cannot say that theoretically, right? That I cannot say theoretically. The only thing I can tell you is the sign of the derivative, right? Of the how effective will be this cross derivative, to put it into some conceptual terms, is going to monotonically move with R. But where is the cutoff point to do it or not to do it? I cannot say for many things, right? Because the real economies are a lot more complicated than these two production functions. And also because there are different industrial policies. I'm just taking one, right? It's a subsidy of entry, but there are other ways to do industrial policy. You can subsidize inputs. I mean, what I'm saying is that this is, is a model, like every model is an abstraction from reality, and we learn qualitative things, but it's not designed to answer that question. Okay?
Thank you.
Yeah, okay, I think I say all this, right? Right, from here, I don't want, again, to get into detail because some of these parameters are not even introduced. For example, this has to do with the demand curve, theta I introduced, but we didn't put attention. And this B is just a function of the externality. But the point is that for every country, there is an optimal subsidy. Okay. And hopefully they just what does it mean is that it's an optimal? Why is important? Let me put it this way. Why is important? Because what I'm just saying is that even countries with high R may have an optimal industrial policy. It's not that it has to be zero, right? There could be, of course, it will vary, but the point is that it doesn't vary with R. Okay. So essentially, the comparative advantage tilts the trade-off, but does not shift the first order condition at the interior optimum. That's what we're showing here. What the way you should eat that result is that even if you go to a country with a high R, the fact per se that they are doing some industrial policy should not be just immediately, oh, okay, that's wrong, right? They might still be doing something optimal. Whether they are doing or not is a different question. Then this proposition, right? Let's this welfare, right? The ratio of welfare when you do the optimal industrial policy compared to when you don't do anything. And this is very important now. It's related to what I said before, but this ratio falls with R. So the optimal policy is not a function of R, but the gains are a function of R. And the gains are lower and lower, the higher and higher is R. That's the same message put in terms of welfare now, okay? But I think I already passed this welfare. Then, for two economies with RA greater than RB, so this is one that has a higher or more intense comparative advantage than this one. The effect of welfare improving subsidies in A is a strict subset of that in B. Equivalently, the same experimental delta is less likely to help in A. Yeah, okay. Fine. So now we get into political economy, right? So let's say that now these policies are not designed just to maximize welfare. Okay, that's an obvious move into the debate. And so basically, we will characterize this by adding this lambda m into the policymaker objective function, right? If lambda m is 1, it's the policymaking maximize welfare. That's it, no problem, okay? But it could be that it's, higher than 1, that means that the policy is sort of biased towards the interest of the manufacturing sector. And if it's lower than 1, it's biased towards the interest of the non-manufacturing sector, okay? So when lambda m is between 0 and 1, the policy system will choose a subsidy that improves on laissez-faire, maybe below the optimal, but it still will improve. Okay, so the point is that essentially is not captured by the manufacturing sector. Okay, when it's greater than 1, then this will be higher than the optimal. Okay. And also, it rises with R. And this is very interesting, because what it's saying is, if you go to an economy that has a comparative advantage in natural resources, but the political system get captured, right, by the industrialists, and that's typical, because if you think, well, it's typical in a democracy at least. Why? Because probably the amount of people that works in the natural resource sector is very small compared to all the workers in the cities, the unions, the business leaders, and so on and so forth. Then that's the worst case for industrial policy, right? Because you get an industrial policy that is above the optimal, and it's higher and higher relative to the optimal, the less desirable is the policy, and the less effective is the policy. Right? Well, that's why it's less desirable, right? But just another way to say it. Is it clear? So here is the problem, right? That we know a lot from a very, look, people tend to really think that we learn a lot about the real world when we do something with data. I'm telling you the opposite too. I'm saying when you look at data, you have to be careful, because you look at it, even if it's a perfect experiment, it's in a context, it's in a setup that you don't control. It's in South Korea. South Korea has an R. So you are only learning whatever it happened for that level of R, but then you will just be providing that result to countries with very different R. How do we extrapolate to those countries? One possibility is like being naive and say, it's not my problem. I just run regressions, I give you the result. Then how do you use it in another setup? It's your problem. And I tell you, I'm guilty as charged. I did that in 80 papers, okay? I know, just, you know what I'm saying. I grow old and get wiser. I'm thinking that, but no, seriously, now, when I was, I wrote this paper about defining external validity. Why I wrote that paper? Because I was submitting a paper. There was an experiment in Argentina, let's say, and have very nice result. And I got rejected at the top 5 saying, you don't have external validity. And I said, come on, no paper has external validity. What do you mean? Why you publish the paper of she and not mine? I was very upset, not because of, for nothing personal. I was saying, I don't see the external validity in her paper. And then I just say, well, people don't understand very well this idea, right? And so it's clear that there is external validity. No one can have it, because what people don't understand is the following, in my view, is that they think that even when you do an experiment, they call it a control experiment, right? RCT, a randomized control experiment. But that doesn't mean you control the setup, like in physics. In physics, you do an experiment, you control everything that matters, and you can replicate the experiment, you get exactly the same result. And if you don't, you're a bad scientist. In social science, you do an experiment. Let's say you go to Kenya, and let's say a deworming experiment, this famous paper in Econometrica where they deworm children and they see whether they do better in school. Let's say that it's all perfect done, and you find that they improve school tests in 3%. They go the year after, you do the same experiment, you find nothing. It's possible. Why? Because the year after there were less worms. And you can control the amount of worms that there are out there in the city, right? It's just something that varies year by year in ways that you don't even understand. And there's many other things, not just the amount of worms. So that here is the R. here is the R. What I'm saying is that any study of industrial policy is done for a given R. And what our very simple model is telling us, look, but these results will vary with R. So be careful how you use it. Okay. So let me skip that because it's more about the political economy and I don't have time and I want to get to how much.
Well, we have like 7 more minutes.
7 more minutes, that's fine. But I want to talk about, maybe I go back to the slide, but so because of this, what is in this paper we want to say also is something related to external validity, and that basically, so far people talk about external validity of a whole something, right? That is a whole thing, it's a unity. And so basically the consensus now is, okay, we care about internal validity, and then external validity can only be achieved by replicating the experiment in many setups, right? That's the best concept. Is you do this experiment 10 times, of course you're not gonna find the same result. And I've done this. I've done one experiment that I did the same experiment in 3 countries. And the only reason I did that study was just to be able to see if I can replicate the results or not, right? And I exploited that data set in many contexts, okay? Because it's very rich. You don't have 3 exact experiments in different setups. But what I'm gonna say is that when we look at external validity in that way, we look at it as blind people, right? We are blind in sense, we don't expect a priority why in one setup should be different from the another. We don't have a prior, okay? So it's all, for us, it's heterogeneity, right? Very, very broadly defined. So I did the experiment in Uruguay, in El Salvador, and in Mexico. And of course, I expected the results to be larger in El Salvador because they started from a worse condition. For the same treatment, if it's positive, I expected. Well, that's something. I already expected that. But many times we don't have even that, right? We may be doing, I don't know, different industrial policies in countries with the same R, let's say, and we don't have a prior why one may work better than other. So let's go to that, the residual component of external validity. The one that we still think can only be learned in replications. But there is another component that is theory-driven, and hence is predictable. And what we show in this paper is very clear what is predictable. It's how the policy will respond to R. So if we sort of now tell the people that done the paper in South Korea, just tell me the R of South Korea, so we take note. And then someone that does another similar evaluation of industrial policy in China, and we recall the R. And then we go to Mexico, and the same policy is done. We record the R. We should see that the results, right, move with R. And that is very useful because then we're not so blind. When we finish a study and we claim that we have internal validity, we now can also say, and also this will extrapolate well, for example, in this case, to countries with the same R or even lower, but not to countries with higher R, right? That you should be careful. Well, that's a lot to say compared to say, I don't know, you have to do another study, right? Because if you think about, we care about causal estimates to use them. So if all I can say is do another study because your R is different, right? It's limit. So that's what I want to emphasize here. So let me get back to something that is not in the paper, but I think we at least should discuss, which is the case because I took as countries that were, because it's the easiest case, right? That they take prices as given, right? Prices as given. So now, let's say that you take a country that for some reason has also an external economy, but it's very large in the world. Okay, it has a very large population. Here you see, you may think that you capture that because we are looking at relative factor endowment. So in some way we are looking at that, but we still say no matter what's the value of your R, prices are given for you. And I say no, prices will not be given for you. So if you expand the manufacturing sector, the prices of the manufactured goods will go down. So again, now we go to South Korea, we do the experiment of industrial policy, we learn it works, and now we go to the US and tell, do it, it works. And the US, even if it's not having a comparative advantage in natural resources, it still cannot extrapolate that result because now it's a large country that cannot take the prices of given. Okay? So what this I'm adding is many possibilities in which essential results will not be transportable from one setup to another that are predicted by theory. There are many more that are not predicted by theory, just as I say, statistical heterogeneity, right? But even without statistical heterogeneity, I think theory can inform a lot about empirical work. I always have that view, by the way, and I'm of the people that think that you cannot interpret data without theory, right? But putting that aside, now we are saying something very concrete about that idea. Okay. How much time do I have?
1 minute.
1 minute. So then the conclusions, you know them. It's industrial policy can raise welfare. When new manufacturers enter and generate spillover, that we basically take it from the literature. There is a case for that. When agriculture is relatively stronger, and in here agriculture could mean oil or minerals, right? Anything that is produced with natural resources, the scope for welfare and enhancing industrial policy is narrower and potential gains are smaller. So giving manufacturing an excessive weight in policy making often lets government to adopt subsidies that excess the social optimum, increasing the risk of welfare loss in agriculturally strong economies. In environments with significant rent destruction, I skipped that, sorry, but that's the part of corruption. Equilibrium subsidies also right with agricultural strength, reducing overall welfare. Right? And then the last point I was making, comparative advantage provides a useful ex-ante guide to predict where industrial policy outcomes are more likely to replicate, okay? So that's the paper, basically. I think it makes very strong points about industrial policy per se, its role to corruption, and its role to generalize how we can also learn from one case to another. Good.
Okay, the queue is open. Yeah, please go ahead.
So much for your interesting presentation. Actually, it was so informative. However, I have some questions about, I'm so familiar with models, not these kinds of models, but I know that, as you mentioned, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I know that all models have some kinds of limitations. So in one of my questions, I have 3 questions about your model. In your agriculture model, the labor permit that you have is basically just like there are lots of other things that are playing there. For example, farmers themselves play another role. For example, their norm, there are identity farmers. For example, identities, their socio-psychological factors. How do you want? Is there any way that you consider these parameters as well in your agriculture model? Because labor is just like a labor, and it doesn't have any characteristics or social thing to me. Is there anything that we could consider it in your model? And the second question is about your resources. Do you see any kinds of limitation in how much resources do you have in your model because resources are limited, and also there is heterogeneity among the resources. For example, some countries might have, I don't know, some specific forests, some other has groundwater resource, and in nature, they're different with each other, and they could have affect enormously the outcome of the model. And the last question is about the climate shock. I know that it's not part of your model, but what if we could add external variables such as climate variables or climate shock that we are facing right now, and how it could affect the outcome of your model?
Okay. So the first question, I think adding farmers, for example, or capitalists for that matter, specifically rights groups, matters for the political economy. I mean, no, it doesn't matter for the equilibrium of the economy or things, but it matters for the political economy. And with Gustavo, we have papers in which we do this very explicit, right? The paper is focused on how, let's say, protectionism is determining political equilibrium, and then, yeah, the share of landlords, whether they are free traders or not, which depends on comparative advantage or not, will play a role. We model explicitly. Here, it's not our objective, right? So we capture that with this lambda m, right? It's all embedded there. In a way, you may think that if you are in a country where the farmers have a lot of political weight because there are many, or because they manage to have a way to express their voice, like in France, they always express their voice. Then the lambda m is lower. So it's there. The point is sometimes, in a model, because things are abstracted in parameters, you have to see where they are, but it's not that completely out of the picture, okay? The climate change shock, of course, it's a completely different issue, right? To the extent that it's producing, using energy, right? Or emitting CO2, somehow produce a negative externality. But then, it's all about, if you think that one solution will be, let's say, a carbon tax, it's a completely different topic, right? I don't see how it fits into this model of industrial policy. I don't think you will change. It will be weird if we now think that the carbon tax will change the comparative advantage of countries. And in any event, how is that going to reduce emissions? We probably will increase emissions if that happens, right? Because now you make to have in comparative advantage countries that don't have probably the best energy, right? So that will be weird. I don't think that's something that belongs to this paper. You have a third question, but
about the resource limitation and heterogeneity among the resource between the countries. For example, did you?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, but that's exactly the point, right? That's the way comparative advantage gets defined in models where there's no difference in technology. If there's no difference in technologies among countries, comparative advantage will basically vary because of difference in relative amounts of resources among countries. Of course, you can write another paper more Ricardian style where you put difference in productivity, but again, it won't change much, I guess, in terms of the logic of the result. It's not going to be that clear that R is a sufficient statistic. And you won't, we did this because, it's very nice to have one sufficient statistic to index all economies.
Sorry, this is a follow-up question. Did you do any kinds of sensitive analysis to see which parameter your model is so sensitive?
I think the results hold for, for example, for all values of theta. There is a restriction. There is a restriction on. There are very few restrictions of parameters. There is a restriction on a combination of some of these parameters, so this is an interior equilibrium, but nothing that I can say, wow, this is really intuitive and I have a lot to say, okay.
Mustafa, and then I think that.
Yeah, very insightful, especially the point about external validity. I have two questions. One is that this model is could be also interpreted as a resource curse model, right? A model of resource curse. That potentially you can look at countries, the ones that have lower R are probably more successful in industrialization. So, and there is a big literature, of course, on that. So I think the evidence might be already there, and compare it with these results. So the first question is basically, is this a resource curse model? And the second question I have, it seems to me that this is a two-country model. You have an advanced industrial country, and you have a developing country that might be able to improve its productivity in manufacturing. And
let me start with the first question, which I think is a very important question and deep in one sense. The problem is, probably it's not clear to me what is a resource curse, right? Because many authors label the resource curse to different things. So if the resource curse is that because you are very well endowed in natural resources, you don't have industrialization. Yes, this model has that feature. No question, we want that, okay? That doesn't mean that the country that then, so what, in that case, a resource curse, it's just an adjective. It's just having a comparative advantage in one sector, you just put it in another name, okay? I mean, it's fine, but to me, at that point, in terms of welfare, it's not yet saying much, okay? There is the issue that in research curves that let me just say it in conceptual terms and then give you 3 examples, right? But we work a lot on this. It's just now operating through the political economy. Is the fact that because you have these natural resources, that doesn't lead in under laissez-faire to a large industrial sector, and then political pressures or whatever led you to protect the manufacturing sector to expand, okay, to expand. That normally, again, if there is this externality in the manufacturing sector, it could be certain level of protection could be optimal, okay? Probably it's less optimal than the subsidy, by the way, but that's, if there is no external economies, then it's never optimal, right? It's just wealth distribution. In that case, I will say the research, just calling a research course, is just misleading in that case, okay? So there has to be these external economies. And then when you have those external economies, if this, I think still that literature has to make this important issue of what's going to happen along the way with the terms of trade, right? Because if the sector that has external economy will keep increasing its productivity relative to the sector that doesn't, and you have natural resources and can you specialize in the sector that doesn't, a priori it seems that you are specializing in a sector that will have a lower productivity growth, but also it may have an increase in terms of trade. So I don't know if that's gonna decrease welfare. So yeah, there is the issue, but it probably was not yet fully analyzed. Yeah.
Yeah, this is really interesting. But I have a question about comparative advantage itself. At the beginning, you suggested that institutions can't explain everything and therefore we have this comparative advantage. But isn't comparative advantage to some extent institutionally structured? Does it come out of nowhere? Is it simply a biophysical phenomenon?
Well, I think from a point of view of economics, you don't have to have difference in institutions to have different comparative advantage. Okay, countries are.
That's true, obviously.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
That's obviously true. But my point was,
But I wasn't trying to say that institutions don't matter. I was trying to say that there is a tendency to jump very fast as institution as a wild card. You can always say, okay, you have worse institutions, so whatever is bad is because of that. And we didn't want in this paper to have more corruption in the countries with high R because of bad institutions. But we, are writing a book about how countries with big R has worse institutions. So it's not that I disagree with you at a fundamental level. I was making the point that in this paper we wanted to rule out that because that's an easy path to explain things, which could be fine. I mean, the point is that in the real world, we know that there are multiple causation of every phenomenon, but in a model you want to isolate one, right? That's the point.
right, yeah, but my point is that maybe comparative advantage is more complex than is accounted for in the paper. That maybe you need to decompose, because of course, whether a country, go back to resource curse, whether a country has a resource blessing or a resource curse often depends a great deal on institutions and other factors in the country, right? So it's not just about the resources it had versus another country or the cost of extracting and producing those resources compared to a cost in another country.
No, I mean, so I might agree, okay? But even if I agree, then it still will be true that ceteris paribus institutions, if a country has diamonds, another country has oil, another country has a lot of land that is very productive for soybean, and another country has a lot of labor, they will have different comparative advantage. And that is what I wanted to capture because I think that's first order. Okay. But still, then, of course, if a country has, for example, a better contract law or culture also, they speak English, they may end up having a comparative advantage in call centers, but if you don't speak English, it doesn't. There are many ways in which you can get to different comparative advantage, but one is very natural, it's natural endowments, okay? Those will not disappear and are first order. You just can look at the history of countries, and these countries that for hundreds of years always were the exporter of youth or exporter of soybean, the reason is mostly availability of certain inputs.
Patricia, one Patricia, Guilherme, and then the other Patricia.
Great, thank you. I have a small question related to this predictable component. You have mentioned this stronger manufacturing sector or a strong agricultural. So how do you define this strong? What the parameters are? Probably it has, and if it has some relation with this empirical component. So
No, in here, the strong predictor is R, right? R is something that you can measure, right? Countries have been ranked for 100 years at least in terms of R. For example, Australia has been always at the top of R, right? And it's a country that in 1850 was very wealthy in gold, 1970 in land, and now in coal. And then Argentina was almost at the top of the table in 1870, and now it's at the middle of the table. So, but the point is that R is measurable. So that is what I refer. R is a very strong determinant of whether industrial policy works or not. And when you see a study, you can know under which R it was done. It's not that you cannot know. You can know that. And that should be an important piece of information to extrapolate the results of the study. I wouldn't extrapolate the results of South Korea, Argentina. I wouldn't. I don't see any scientific basis to do that.
Guilherme, I think you're next, and then Patricia.
Thank you for your presentation. So I have to ask you this. If we were in the same presentation, likely in Brazil or in Argentina, we would have someone with some traditional industrialist school view in which they would point it out that their theory should be related to the dynamics in prices and the movements in terms of trade. So basically, I think that one point in your model is that the results are static. And I honestly would like to see your take on that specific point that they would make, that the wages might change over time with the changes in terms of trade. So, because I think the narrative would be likely the opposite in that case. I mean, their schools should be likely pointing out to the existence of gains for the industrial policy only 10 years or 20 years from now if the prices change.
What answer do you want? Like a very politely academic or the truth?
I mean, I'm not, I don't want to go on views, but I would like to.
Same price, I can give you one.
Yeah.
Look, these guys didn't understand general equilibrium. I mean, how is going to change the analysis? So suppose I tell you, look, now when we look at dynamically, we see that the prices, the terms of trade of the manufacturing sectors will go up. First of all, they cannot go up forever, right? This doesn't make sense, but we never seen that. But suppose I tell you they're going to go up for 20 years. Still, there are going to be countries that have a comparative advantage in the manufacturing, countries that don't, and it will be the same countries, right? So I don't see, I mean, again, when we judge a model, of course the model makes assumption. The question is whether it really makes something that twists the result and then it never holds back the result when it makes changes so important like the one you mentioned or not. I think basically Previch had a very wrong view about, I mean, he's first of all, he extrapolated from a time series of 10 years to the whole history, and which we see was not true. But second, he never thought about how that really changed the decisions of the firms, right?
That was politically correct, or the
The politically correct it will be, it's a really good question.
Guilherme, you want to?
No, I'm not defending their point.
I know. You are doing the. I know you very well.
You really wanted to see your this.
Patricia.
Thank you for your presentation. I learned a lot actually, and I have more than a question, a precision. So I am not an economics scholar. So you mentioned that the best case for an industrial policy is when the economy is small. By a small, what do you mean?
Okay. Yeah, it's a very good question. It's a very good question because it's something we didn't model at the end, and I wasn't totally precise. I'm saying, imagine two economies that had a comparative advantage in manufacturing, okay? And you have the same technology, everything, but one is very large because it has a lot of people, right? It's large in that sense. The other is very small in terms, say, has South Korea, right? So the large economy, if it does industrial policy and if it expand the manufacturing sector, it will affect the world price equilibrium. So the effect of the industrial policy will be less effective in that economy because it stimulates the supply, but because it decreases the price, it stimulated less in the equilibrium. While in the other economy, because it's small and it doesn't affect the world market equilibrium prices, it got all the effects of the externality. Okay, that's what I mean.
I'm checking if you have any questions online. So people online want to ask some questions. It doesn't seem so. Raise your hand or just ask. Okay, so it doesn't seem. Do you have more questions? Jess, you want to go?
This is sort of building back on Mustafa and Claudia's points. So either we want to be able to say something about whether industrial policy will be effective, right? Or we want to make some general statement that helps us understand the general components of external validity through the lens of this model. And it seems to me that, like, you know, in my understanding of the resource curves, for example, there isn't yet a component of any version of the resource curve that says it actually shrinks the policy space. There's versions of it that talk about, like, you know, there's the development side, there's the conflict side, there's the, you know, institution side, but in terms of actual, like, what kinds of policies will, you know, that if you try them in this context, will they work or not? I'm not especially familiar with that as a component of the resource curve, and so it seems like that, like, just building on what Mustafa said, that actually could be another framing of the contribution, but it then does require that we know what the cutoff point is, right? And so it's not just the comparative advantage of having a lot of that natural resource, but, like, at what point should we expect these policy tools to be less?
But you can say things like that. Suppose you can say, look, we have this result in South Korea, right? Let's say. Now, I know that in my country, because our R is higher, it will be less effective, okay? So of course, the model doesn't tell us what proportion less effective. But suppose that we can say something like, if it's 10% less effective, not worth it, right? Something like that. Then it's telling a lot, because it's probably you will know that it's going to be 10%. If it's telling, no, still if it's 50% less effective, it still will be worth it. And you have a sense that you're not 50% away. I mean, it's not rigorous. I'm just saying that it's very difficult, right? The problem is that the idea that we sell as academics, and we love because it's in our own interest to sell it, that we can enforce policy very precisely, it's a bit naive. And I tell you, because I was deputy minister, and I tell you in this sense, the minister of, this is true, okay, it's not recorded, right?
Yes, they are.
Okay, whatever, it doesn't matter. I just passed it. I passed politically correctness. So the guy, the Ministry of Social Policy wants me to convince to finance some land titling policy, and she's so brilliant. She said, "Oh, he has the most cited paper, so I'm sure he's going to buy it." So she came to ask me for like I don't know, 0.3 of GDP. It was no way I was going to give you that money. But also, you know, I say, look, I mean, you are extrapolating from this paper where I show that it has some positive effects, but I also show that it was not the optimal way to do it. So if you want to really work out, we start to have to think about how we do it better, because we also have evidence. Well, she's asking me, well, how is good? I say, I don't know that, but we need to do a pilot. We need to think about that, right? So I think research well used, it's informative, but never definitive for a policy decision.
I think my main concern is really that, like, when you having been guilty of similar kinds of things where you make some sort of statement about the comparative statics coming out of a model, and then say, oh, well, this story fits well in the, like, is characterized by these comparative statics, and this story is much more like, fits, these are the this is where it comes out in terms of what we think, but these are high or low in terms of values, in terms of these parameters. Look, it sort of holds true for these cases as a result, without really a rigorous statement as to like why it is that this particular context, right? And so sort of occupies that particular value of a particular parameter. And so it seems like, right, one of the arguments, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're kind of making, is that you can make these decisions when you have the like relevant countries in mind, because you can sort of say that these two, one is higher than the other. We don't need to know the exact cutoff, so long as we can have a relevant comparison that allows us.
I think having this knowledge is informative. For example, if you show me a result from South Africa, from South Korea, and I'm running the industrial policy in Argentina, I wouldn't say I'm doing it based on that paper. I will be lying if I do that. If you are in Vietnam or in a small Asian country, well endowed in labor, maybe I say, yeah, it's a good input for us. It's qualitative, but it's better than just saying, I don't know how it generalizes at all, or the opposite. Yeah, it generalizes everywhere, which I think are two wrong ways to read the paper.
Claudia.
Last question, I promise, so we can enjoy the dessert. Does your argument apply regardless of the subsidies is for domestic subsidies or international subsidies? For example, tax breaks for foreign companies, or providing domestic subsidies for creation of own companies. Does it apply to both? Or does it need further?
I think the general nature, it applies to any policy that tries to stimulate one sector. Now the specifics will change probably. I need to work out the model. I can't say that. But the general nature of the trade-off, I think are very general, are really going back to the most basic economic mechanisms of how resources get assigned to one sector or another based on comparative advantage and so relative costs and prices.
Okay.
That's opportunity for questions, I would say, and otherwise we are going to let you to summarize or.
No, I mean, I think it's
1 minute or whatever, a couple of minutes.
Okay, I think again, I mean, I see, like the paper, I see that it comes with important results and are in terms of positive economics. Although in that area, I will say probably people that at least understand trade know them, right? One way or another. Then there is the political economic results, which I think are more interesting in the sense that it's not driven by different institutions, although different institutions could exacerbate the issues, but we don't need to make that claim. And you cannot discredit the argument that it didn't work in some countries because of corruption, because corruption is endogenous. That's very important. You have to expect more corruption in precisely in the places that's not going to work, and that's a very important result. And third, I think it helped us to elaborate more on the issue of external validity, and I hope that in the future, applied papers try to say something about what the theory says about how those results will generalize. That you don't read right now in papers. You read, this is the result, there is this other result, it's consistent or not, but it's always at the level of every result could be different with no pattern. And here what we're emphasizing is there are patterns. And the patterns are well predicted by theory, and applied work should incorporate.
Thank you very much, and thanks everybody.